Welcome everyone to the Global Reading Network's webinar today. My name is Allison Flepson. I work on the Reading Within Reach team based at URC in Chevy Chase, Maryland. And we are responsible for supporting the Global Reading Network and carrying out a variety of other activities to support early grade reading improvement efforts. As many of you know, we periodically organize these webinars on topics of interest to the Global Reading Network members. And we're happy today to have several speakers who are going to be talking about language policy, language planning, and practice in early grade reading programs. We've heard from many of you that this is an issue that programs are dealing with every day as they identify what language of instruction policies they are following, as they develop materials for learners, and as they work with teachers in the classrooms to find the most effective ways of teaching reading. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Right today we have Susan Bruckner from Education Development Center, Dina Ocampo, who was formerly with the Philippines Department of Education, and Wendy Ralangita, who's out in Nepal right now with RTI International, and Jum Rai, who's with the Nepal Language Commission. So we in particular thank Wendy and Jum for joining us very late at night, their time, to share with you their experiences in Nepal. And Wendy will also be talking about the experience in Ethiopia. So let me just introduce Susan briefly for those of you who may not already be familiar with her work. Susan Bruckner is a senior international technical advisor at EDC. She has extensive experience in basic education and program management, design, and implementation. She served as a project director and senior technical advisor to programs in Asia, Africa, and Central America. And she currently provides support to early grade reading, math, community engagement activities. Prior to joining EDC, she served as an education development officer with USAID, and she managed basic education, higher education, and workforce development programs. Susan is the project director for the program in the Philippines that she'll be talking about today, and she will be talking about the experience along with her colleague Dina Ocampo, who will be presenting via recorded video. So without further ado, I will turn the presentation over to Susan.
Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. This first presentation will focus on the Philippines, both how the mother tongue-based multilingual education policy came to be, and then how Basa Pilipinas, the USAID-funded basic education project, has been supporting the implementation of this policy since 2013. For part one, I would like to introduce Dr. Dina Ocampo. Dr. Ocampo is a leading voice in language and reading education in the Philippines. As the Undersecretary for Curriculum and Instruction of the Department of Education from 2013 to 2017, she was instrumental in the effective implementation of the country's K-12 curriculum reform effort, including the national policy shift in 2012 towards promoting mother tongue-based multilingual education in kindergarten through grade 3. In addition to her tenure as Undersecretary, Dr. Ocampo currently serves as a steering committee member of the Global Reading Network, as well as professor at the University of the Philippines College of Education. While we were unable to interview her for this webinar live, the Basa team was able to interview her a couple of weeks ago specifically for this presentation.
Well, the Philippines decided to do research on what the national standards for English language, Filipino language, and teaching and learning strategies way back in 2005. And prior to that, over many decades, Philippines has been looking at lingua franca education. There's sound research and robust studies, findings on the benefits of using the mother tongue as the fundamental language of literacy for children. That if children learn to read and write in their mother language first, then they tend to learn to read and write faster, more efficiently, better in subsequent languages of education. And this is very important to do in multilingual nations, such as the Philippines. No? we have over 170 languages. And therefore, children speak different languages all over the Philippines at home. And giving value to those languages when children enter school is very important, because that means that their culture, their mother languages are important to schools, and schools recognize them. And I think this is the big challenge, because we need to understand communities better. What languages are spoken in communities, and how do you now make sure that everyone's language has a place in the places of learning or in schools. This is why we did it. It's for the children. The preparations for all of that was massive. We had to work with teachers, we had to work on materials, we had to look at strategies, and of course, we had to embed a systematic and important monitoring and evaluation framework to make sure that mother tongue education or multiliteracy education is implemented properly, because there is a transition from the bilingual education policy to the multilingual education policy. The transition is ongoing, as a matter of fact, and the monitoring and evaluation framework and the tools for that were laid out, and hopefully this will show us in another maybe 3-4 years whether the implementation has been good and whether instruction has been improving as well. First, we had to look at what the languages of the children were. They needed to do a good mapping of languages that children spoke, who are the children who spoke these languages, and who are the teachers who spoke these languages. So it was important to match them. That was a very big challenge, because we didn't have census data for that at that time. The other one that is important was the shift from thinking that this is about teaching languages. But this point of view is, we will use this language because this is the language that children spoke. In other words, that is the language of their comprehension. And I think that is the most important principle behind MTBM. Another challenge has to do with instructional materials, because what we need to do is to have instructional materials that will now be converted to materials that are consistent with the languages of these communities. And that was a struggle. You need time to do that, and you can't really do that on a run. However, it is amazing that we were able to produce a good number of instructional materials for literacy and all other subjects, so that we could use the mother languages to teach the content. And content-based literacy is also very important, because teaching these subjects in the mother tongues give the mother tongues credibility to children and to teachers. Standardization was an issue, but using certain parameters, rubrics, and so on, we were able to try and approximate that they were teaching the same thing using the same level of difficulty. Because we needed to make sure that the language used in books for children is the language of children. There are hits and misses, as can be expected, and I do hope that in the coming years, this will be improved, so that communities accept these languages and these books as rendered in the way that they want their language to be represented. Assessing in many languages means that you need to have assessment materials that are more or less of the same level of difficulty as well. This is an issue only when assessment is large scale or high stakes. It's when it's high stakes or across divisions or across regions, when you need that the test in Cebuano Vinisaya is of the same difficulty as that of Waray at the end of grade 3. And I think that is also a challenge. And I think that once more experience is gained in developing the test, in assessing the test, I think we will have better quality high-stakes assessments. I think that the Philippines is quite lucky to have had this challenge, but also I'm very proud. I'm really, really proud that they have put the child learner in the center of education reform. And this is a very clear example of putting the child first, meaning respecting the child's language. Certain places or certain schools in the Philippines implemented MTB-MLE ahead. And this was done with the help of other government agencies For example, the Komisyon sa Wikang Filipino, which helped in the construction of working orthographies. Working orthographies became necessary because the development of an official orthography is a very long process. So working orthographies became the venue by which the Komisyon sa Wikang Filipino and the Department of Education collaborated. Working with NGOs such as the Summer Institute for Linguistics allowed us now to access the knowledge that they had accumulated over decades of research on linguistics. No? And this has been very important for the Philippines because many of partners and colleagues within SIL are immersed in communities. And so they were able to help create the materials, train the teachers, and most importantly, advocate to parents that this was very beneficial to children. There are donor agencies or INGOs or partners in education in the international community who were very excited at the prospect of mother tongue literacy. And I think that mother tongue literacy allows us to collaborate because these are projects that are being done in Africa, in South America, in other parts of Asia. And of course, the Philippines had so much to contribute. One of the ways that we enhanced the partnership between an INGO such as USAID and the Philippines was to ask the INGO to pilot a process. And when we could see whether that process was working, using evidence-based processes. For example, we looked at whether the teachers were happier, whether the teachers felt more capable, more competent, whether children were actually reading better, writing better, comprehending better. Then we had help, for example, from a USAID to look at assessment of early literacy through Basa Pilipinas to pilot processes and inform the processes for the rest of the country. And I think that kind of relationship is very important because there is purpose to the partnership. At the stage of the Philippine educational system's reform at that time, for me, that was the kind of partnership that was needed. A partnership that was purposeful and determined to prove a certain or to investigate a certain question. And I think that's very important. There are also partners who have their own emphasis. Other partners were into creating big books or helping teachers write books or write better materials. But what we tried to do was to look at it as a huge jigsaw puzzle, and everybody could fit into this puzzle with a different shaped piece. And so we could build the multilingual literacy program better with that collaboration. If there is someone orchestrating the interaction of government, of DepEd, with INGOs, Philippine NGOs, other government agencies of the Philippines, if somebody was orchestrating it, somebody knew the puzzle and what the puzzle should look like, then everybody had a place in the reform.
Na makita di dyan ti lugar dapat dito ada simbahan. Apa nga mapunayan nga simbahan dito? Naglalayinda ada cross na very good. No da makita yung ada cross na di jay.
As Dr. Ocampo mentioned, Basa Pilipinas has been a close partner of the Philippines Department of Education in implementing the mother tongue-based multilingual education reforms. This presentation provides some additional detail on how this USAID-funded basic education activity implemented by EDC has been supporting the implementation of this policy in the Philippines. To give you a quick overview, Basa Pilipinas is USAID Philippines' flagship basic education activity, spanning a total of 5.5 years. The activity was designed in close collaboration with the Philippines Department of Education. DepEd assigned 2 out of the 19 mother tongue languages to Basa as its focus mother tongues, namely Sinungbangnan, Binisaya, and Ilocano. These languages determined the regions and divisions in which Basa targeted for direct implementation. Region 1 is where Ilocano is the predominant mother tongue, while Region 7's predominant mother tongue is Binisaya. The mother tongue-based multilingual education policy was launched in the 2012-2013 school year, and it requires that children in grade 1 are taught to read in the mother tongue identified for their region, while Filipino and English are treated as oral language subjects. In grade 2, students are introduced to reading and writing in Filipino and to reading in English. However, the official language of instruction remains mother tongue through grade 3. In grade 4, there is a transition to English as the language of instruction for math and science, and to Filipino for other content subjects. This policy assumes that improved literacy instruction and outcomes in mother tongue in grade 1 will lead to similar improvements in students' Filipino and English literacy skills by grade 4. BASA supports the implementation of the K-3 language arts curriculum, which is where the mother tongue-based multilingual education implementation is concentrated. The project worked with DepEd to produce teacher guides to support reading instruction in the 4 languages, Filipino, English, and the 2 mother tongues. Additionally, BASA also provided the accompanying read aloud books and leveled readers to support the instructional routines specified in the teacher guides. For kindergarten, BASA developed a set of 40 big books in both mother tongues, aligned with the weekly themes specified in DepEd's kindergarten curriculum. In addition, to help build children's love of reading, BASA provided supplementary books for classroom libraries, again, in all 4 languages. The revised teacher guides, also called RTGs, are instructional tools intended for the use of grades 1 to 3 teachers. They are compilations of lessons that the teachers implement in the classrooms to help learners develop their reading skills in the 14 domains of literacy outlined in the curriculum. These guides provide the instructional routines that teachers use in implementing the DepEd curriculum using BASA-provided leveled readers and read-aloud books in the mother tongue. Part of the literature-based instructional routines found in the RTGs is the use of leveled readers. BASA developed leveled readers for all the relevant languages covered in grades 1 to 3. Mother tongue leveled readers were developed for all 4 quarters of grade 1 instruction and for the first quarter of grade 2 instruction. As you'll note on the slide, some titles have 2 versions to support learners with differing abilities. Examples of modifications include larger text or similar content with less complex sentence structure, like reduced dialogue. Here's an example of a grade 2 Ilocano leveled reader. I share this particular text as an example of how BASA embedded messages of family supporting learning and how what is learned in school supports real-world work activities. Interactive read-aloud activities are integrated into the instructional routines promoted by BASA in its grade 1 through 3 teacher guides. This is done across languages. For grades 1 to 2, read-aloud books were selected based on weekly themes aligned with DepEd's curriculum. For the read-alouds used in mother tongue instruction, existing commercially published titles in Filipino that suited the weekly themes were adapted into BASA's assigned mother tongues. Kindergarten teaching and learning is done exclusively in the mother tongue. As mentioned earlier, BASA developed a total of 40 big book titles aligned with the weekly themes. These materials were produced in the 2 mother tongues and underwent the required DepEd content and language reviews before they could be printed and used in kindergarten classrooms. BASA provided 2 cycles of training to support the effective implementation of the curriculum, including the use of these big books. This slide shows the first 10 titles used during the first quarter of the school year. When DepEd revised its kindergarten teacher's guide, it also needed to come up with a revised version of its kindergarten learners material. These are essentially activity sheets that children can complete as part of their weekly and daily instruction. BASA supported a write chop that developed the source or mother document that would then get adapted into the various mother tongues used in kindergarten classrooms. BASA also worked with DepEd partners to develop the Ilocano and Binasaya contextualized versions of the learner material. The BASA approach to mother tongue-based multilingual education incorporates a balanced literacy approach involving language and word study, reading instruction and writing instruction. And of course, the development of oral language skills is integral to the learning process, not only as a foundation, but for ongoing learning. Bridging is a key strategy used in multilingual education. With bridging, We are looking at relationships and supporting children in leveraging what they already know to gain new knowledge. In bridging, we explicitly teach what is the same and what is different in mother tongue, Filipino, and English. By showing learners how to make these links or connections, it becomes easier for them to become better speakers, readers, and writers in all three languages. Areas that are explored during the bridge can include similarities and differences in sound symbol correspondence, word structure, root words, use of infixes and suffixes, attention to gender, syntax, and grammar, culture surrounding the language use, and the extent to which two languages or three share features facilitates or hinders transfer. Among the materials that POUCY developed to support the application of bridging strategies are the RTGs, which includes bridging notes to teachers in designated parts of each lesson, and trigger videos that can be used for school-based continuing professional development. The videos POUCY developed outline the importance of using bridging strategies and demonstrate strategies and activities teachers can use in the classroom for conducting those bridging moments. These include helping students notice cognates between two languages, comparing and contrasting verb forms in three languages, or having children develop cross-linguistic vocabulary skills through drawing and writing activities. The POUCY materials also promote gender fairness and inclusion. For example, the kindergarten big books incorporate positive images, inclusive messages, and gender fair role models, as seen in the above story, Supergirl, POUCY. In sum, POUCY Pilipinas has actively supported mother tongue-based multilingual education in the K-3 key stage and in its assigned mother tongues. To date, we have provided 1.4 million units of mother tongue reading materials. It has also supported the development of kindergarten learners materials to be used by all schools teaching in the two assigned mother tongues. DepEd is also scaling up and institutionalizing the use of POUCY-developed leveled readers, making these accessible via their official resource portal, and also printing and procuring copies to be used by schools across the Philippines. EDC is very pleased to have been part of this partnership that demonstrates how effective mother tongue-based multilingual education can be implemented in the Philippine public schools. And before I end, I'd like to make a quick shout out to Cess Ochoa, who is our Deputy Chief of Party for Technical, who is instrumental in leading our team out there, and also to Nancy Clark Chiarelli, who's the Senior Reading Specialist and Technical Advisor for EDC, who is instrumental in developing and supporting and guiding the development of some of these materials.
Thank you very much, Susan, and also Dina, for providing that overview. We're now going to turn to the experience from Nepal. We have our speaker, Jum Rai, who's going to be talking about a program in Nepal that's currently working to provide education in a variety of first and mother tongue languages. So Jum, I will turn it over to you. While he's getting set up, why don't I actually give a bit of a background on Jum and how he is affiliated with the program. He began his career in as a secondary teacher and has worked at all levels of the education system in Nepal. He's worked with in teacher training as well as the school supervision and has experience planning and implementing at both district and central levels. As the National Early Grade Reading Program in Nepal began rolling out, he played a key role first as the Ministry of Education's program coordinator and then as the program liaison manager with the team working on this project. He's currently the Undersecretary on Nepal's Language Commission, where he's overseeing multiple language and education studies and contributing to language policy and planning.
In the northern part of Nepal, we can find the Tibeto-Burman languages, and in the southern part of Nepal, there are Indo-European languages, and in between, we can find the mixture of both Tibeto-Burman and Indo-European languages, meaning that we have several languages with distinct features. For example, difference in phones and language structure, grammar, and so on. Actually, right now we have 123 languages distributed in 77 districts. And in census wise, the number of languages, you can see that in the early 1950s, there are only 44 languages. And right now we have 123. And between 1971 to 1981, there are only 17 and 18 languages, meaning that in that time, we don't have open policy by the then government. And regarding the language family, Indo-European languages, for example, Nepali, Awadhi, Maithili, it is about 82%. And in Tibeto-Burman, it is only 17.35%. In Austroasian, it is less than 1%, and Dravid, it is also less than 1%, that is 0.13%. And one language, that is Kusunda, which has not been recognized within these four language family. Let me correct the word major. I don't think these 19 languages are major, but regarding the number of speakers, there are only 19 languages that represents about 96% of population in Nepal. Remaining 104, there's only 4%. The 4% or 104 languages are in endangered status or condition in Nepal. We need to protect, conserve these languages. And regarding the speaker of Nepali language as a first language and second language, it is about 76.91% in total. As a first language, it is 44.64%, and as a second language, it is used by 32.27%. The constitutional provision of language, there are 7 articles which have defined the language as an important issue in Nepal. In Article 6, all the mother tongues spoken in Nepal are regarded as the national languages. Equal status to all the languages has been given by the Constitution of Nepal. No dialect, only languages. Article 7, the Nepali language written in Devanagari script as the language of official business in Nepal, official language, but provincial government can select one or more national languages for official use. This responsibility has been given to provincial government by the Constitution. And the government of Nepal can decide any lingual issue based on the recommendation of Language Commission. Article 18, we have right to equality. There will not be discrimination among any citizens on the ground of languages, whether they are endangered in position or not. In Article 31, all the citizens will have a right to acquire education in its mother tongue up to school level. Under the Article 32, each person and community shall have a right to use their languages, whether in the office or in out of office, or in community, or in the family. And under the Article 32, we have right to preserve and promote our language, script, and culture. And the 7th article, that is 287, there is a provision of Language Commission with 4 broad scope of works, which are to determine the basis for a language to acquire status of official language and to forward recommendation to government of Nepal. Second one is to provide recommendation to the government of Nepal on measures to be adopted for protection, promotion and development of languages, especially for endangered languages. And third one is to measure developmental status, a level of mother tongues, and to make recommendation to the government on potential for using them in education. And the last one is carried out different research studies and monitoring in the field of languages. And one study which has been carried out by the Ministry of Education and the development partner, Australian development partner, which is my medium of instruction and language for education, recommends that small number of schools using mother tongue as medium of instruction in early grades under donor-funded pilot or NGO projects. Some additional schools have mother tongue as subject, local subject period on timetable. Curriculum Development Center developed textbook for 26 languages, but it is only translated version of Nepali. Non-Nepali mother tongue is used rarely in official medium of instruction, but informal use or code switching in common. Great demand for English and increasingly common for schools to use English as medium of instruction even in lower primary. But we can say that the preparation of teachers, teaching materials are yet to be developed in Nepalese context. Demand for mother tongue varies across district and communities. Since there are 123 languages with different phonemes, language structure, the mother tongue modality needs to be differentiated from district to district. One type of the one homogeneous modality will not be appropriate for all district and community. Let me throw some lights on the activities which are undertaken by the Commission of Nepal. Actually, we are starting dialogue with the different stakeholders, language community and socio-political leaders for developing basics and criteria for official languages, which is very quite difficult and it is very socio-political issue. We need to discuss in a very low level to the central level to make a common consensus between all the stakeholders. Similarly, we are going to organize interaction program in the state level, provincial level and local level to preserve, conserve and develop the corpus of the languages. And we have prepared a 5 years roadmap based on the 4 scope of works given by the Constitution. Similarly, we have developed roster network of linguists and language community to work collaboratively developing, preserving and conserving languages. Right now we are going to formulate language policy, rules and regulation to execute all the scope of works given to the Commission. And we have also planned to carry out several research works to find out the status of mother tongues in order to find out their feasibility to use in education. Similarly, we are going to develop and digitize the endangered languages of Nepal. And lastly, we are going to identify the language maps in the schools of all districts. Thank you very much.
So I will go ahead. This is Wendy Rolangita. I just want to mention a little bit the sort of genesis of what I'm presenting. When I was talking to Allison about this webinar, I was reflecting on the experience in Ethiopia, which was a large-scale early grade reading program meant to support a mother tongue supportive policy. And then working in Nepal, which also is a large-scale early grade reading program, also meant to support a mother tongue supportive policy here. But those two experiences have been very different. In terms of the language context, what was happening with the policy, and then in terms of what was meant to happen in the program and what has happened in the program. So I thought it would be interesting to share some of that experience. So Jumrai has shared a lot of details about the Nepal situation, the context here in terms of language and language policy. So I'm going to first start with giving a little bit of idea of that context in Ethiopia, and then I'm going to talk about the two early grade reading programs in those two places. So first of all, this is a little linguistic map of Ethiopia, and one of the interesting features is that a good bit of the country has large areas that have one dominant language, or a number of the languages cover large areas of the country, but at the same time there are pockets where there are many languages. For example, southwest Ethiopia, which is essentially the SNNPR region, has many languages. There are 85 languages altogether, indigenous languages, and I just gave an idea of the 10 languages that with the most first language speakers. And as indicated in the right column, 5 of those are actually also state regional official languages, while another 5 are within that very diverse region in the country. So this just gives an example of this sort of profile of languages in Ethiopia. Looking at Ethiopia language policy in 1955, the Ethiopian constitution at that time instituted Amharic as the official national language and medium of instruction, with the idea that would create a unified country. Then in 1991, 1994, the new Ethiopian constitution actually began to recognize the importance of each different language group's language, stating that all Ethiopian languages shall enjoy equal state recognition, while Amharic remained the working language in the federal government. Each of the state regions were able to make laws to determine their own working language, and honored the right of every nation, nationality, and people in Ethiopia to speak, write, and develop its own language. And then the 1994 education and training policy was right in line with that. It stated that primary education should be given in nationality languages, local languages, that groups could either, in terms of making decisions, they could use their own language, they could use a regional language. Teacher training for kindergarten and primary should take place in the local language. Amharic still needed to be taught nationwide since it remained the federal language, and English would be the medium of instruction for secondary and higher education, while in primary it would be taught as a subject. So at the time that the project started in 2012, looking at what was actually happening, overall, we could say that the regions were generally following the policy in terms of using mother tongue at lower primary. But most of those textbooks had been translated from Amharic. They were not developed in or for most of the target mother tongues. Some of the smaller language communities didn't have any materials. Some of the regions were transitioning to English not waiting till secondary. They were transitioning earlier in primary. And in many places where there is many languages in one area, they would select one local language for MOI, which meant that other children in that area couldn't benefit from education in their mother tongue. And in some cases, state regions would choose an MOI that was, yes, majority predominant in that region, but still left some children out who spoke a different mother tongue. So then looking at the two programs in Ethiopia and Nepal, Ethiopia was USAID's Reading for Ethiopia's Achievement Developed Technical Assistance, RETA, and in Nepal it's the Early Grade Reading Program. And in both cases, they're meant to be technical assistance programs to a government, technical assistance to a government program, programs that the government already had in place. And they both sort of followed many of the classical supports, developing materials, developing training teachers. In Ethiopia, there was also a pre-service component. Community support in Ethiopia was handled through a different project. And in Nepal, similarly, materials development, teacher training, parents and communities, and looking at systems and service delivery. In terms of what was happening specifically related to languages, or what's meant to happen in the program design, in Ethiopia, the program was expected to support the government to develop syllabi, spoken sequences, teaching and learning materials for grades 1 through 8 in 7 Ethiopian languages, training materials, pre-service, as well as to develop English as a second language materials for grades 1 through 8. And those 7 languages included 4 regional state languages and 3 languages from that really diverse southwestern region of SNNPR. So the idea of, of course, there's limited funding. You can't support all the languages at once. So they took they used a combination of the languages with the highest population, but also making sure that state that was very diverse also had some support, at least for some of its languages. In Nepal, the language aspects of the program design was to develop a spoken sequence and teaching and learning materials for grades 1 through 3 in Nepali, for Nepali first language speakers. Also for grades 1 through 3, develop spoken sequence, teaching and learning materials in 3 other Nepali mother tongues, and to develop spoken sequence and teaching and learning materials for Nepali as a second language. So this is an attempt to address the very complex language profile that Jim was mentioning. There's also a component to support raising public awareness on the importance of mother tongue and to support research and examining policy and management planning for dealing with language and teacher assignment. So that's what the program designs included, both very logical when you look at what the policy documents were saying in a kind of sense of where they were at the start of the programs. So then, looking at what has happened and what factors related to the language context have supported as well as been challenges in those programs. In Ethiopia, some of the supportive factors of the policy and what was happening on the ground when the project started, including the fact that there was already, people already valued, both on the ground and in the government, valued the importance of mother tongue instruction. That was already accepted. An attempt to use mother tongue as a medium of instruction was already widely in use. There were quality issues, but they were trying on a large scale. So as I mentioned before, many of the books were translated, but they had books and they were trying to use them. So the quality of that was what needed to be worked on. And the English, not uncommon in Ethiopia as elsewhere, a lot of parents want their students to be learning, want their children to be learning English, and having an English development component of the program helped to respond to that need, but it was also a way that helped the program and the government to talk about how you can have a good design that includes both mother tongue and bridging to English. some of the challenges, various dialects within the mother tongue that had not initially been accounted for. Maybe not dialects isn't the right word, but basically when we were developing, for example, Amharic, or supporting the government to develop Amharic materials, it was they were developed by the Amhara regional state. And what would happen is that in other regional states, there are also pockets of Amharic speakers, and which they needed Amharic materials. But they felt the materials developed by the Amharic regional state didn't necessarily meet their needs. There might be some vocabulary differences, but there would also be a lot of differences in the children's local context, and they wanted the materials to reflect their local context. So this hadn't been really conceptualized at the outset of the program, but we then said, okay, well, we'll do an adaptation. So they took those Amharic materials developed by the Amhara regional state and adapted them for their local context. And of course, other languages, there's 85 indigenous languages in the southern state. There's, many, many other languages than the 3 in that region that we were supporting. So of course, representatives of other language communities were constantly asking, well, when are we going to get materials developed? And that was a difficult thing for both the program and the government to respond to. And that remained a challenge because that's what we had money for. And then political sensitivities could impact some of the decisions around the mother tongue materials. This wasn't a huge issue. It certainly didn't stop us being able to move forward with the development of materials. But things like in the Somali region, they raised questions about, were we changing the order of the alphabet? And aside from the technical aspect, helping them to understand the technical aspect, it seemed clear that there was also sort of a control and power issue, and asserting that we want to make sure we have control of the materials for our region, even though people from the region were working on them. I think that was partly a way to assert that these are our materials, so we need to pay close attention. So then moving on to Nepal. So overall, the challenges were things that came up as we went that we had to address, but they didn't slow down really the process of developing the materials in those 7 languages, because there are many ways in which the context was primed for that work. Nepal, there's some of the supportive factors that were there at the beginning of the program, was that there was already a policy for supporting mother tongue, and that the Ministry of Education had already started working on how can we, like in the National Early Grade Reading Program, it already emphasized needing to develop and support mother tongue at the policy. These documents existed at the policy level, and some small-scale exercises in mother tongue had taken place, as June was saying, in some pilot schools and some non-government NGO-supported programs. Some of the challenges that were encountered as the program was rolling out, the program was very rationally based on what was happening in the policy documents. There had not yet, the report that June Rai mentioned had not yet been released before the program was designed, so it couldn't quite take advantage of those findings. What happened was that within a few months after the initiation of the project, the new constitution of Nepal was ratified. So we entered into a very highly political period. During that, just after the ratification, there were some ethnicities that were staging protests because they weren't unhappy with certain things in the constitution. So then, and also the ratification of the new constitution then kicked off a transition, a process of transitioning to federalism from a highly centralized to a highly decentralized system. So in that context, you also have people, some government colleagues, stakeholders on the ground who aren't necessarily completely convinced of mother tongue in education. A lot of parents want their kids to be learning English. Some of the Nepali speakers don't necessarily understand the importance of children learning in those other languages. And at the same time, then many of the government colleagues may recognize the political sensitivities. And so it can be hard, like at the very beginning, when all of this is happening and we're saying, but we're supposed to develop mother tongue materials, I think rightfully so, some of the government colleagues could feel hesitant because of this highly political period. And the other thing is that the planning for mother tongue and how it was going to all work, how are you going to deal with this different communities that have different needs and different demands, the planning for that was still quite new when the program came on. There were still many important how questions that hadn't really been thought through yet. So we were sort of meant to, in our own design, we were meant to just dive in and start developing materials, but that turned out not to be so realistic because of some of these issues. I will say now that with the shift to federalism, so the shift to federalism is really happening now, although one of our colleagues today reminded us it can take a decade to really get fully in place. And with the work of the Language Commission that June was outlining, these things present a new window of opportunity. So, you know, a couple years into the program, we haven't been able to move as far forward as we would have liked with mother tongue as well as Nepali as a second language. But we see some new opportunities that we may now have a better opportunity to move forward on those things. So in closing, I just wanted to mention a couple of the things that I have been reflecting on and thinking on in terms of what are the implications of these experiences for program planning. And so one of the things I think is really important is that we need to take political realities seriously. Language choices are never just about pedagogy. We sometimes I think we like to think of ourselves sometimes as technicists. And of course, children learn better in their mother tongue. And that if we can just make everyone understand that, everything will be easy. But language choices are I might say always political, or most of the time there's also a very political side to them, and we have to recognize that and be sensitive to that. So as we're working on planning, if we can't undertake a really thorough or get a thorough understanding of both the policy, yes, what's written on the documents, but also what are the ground realities? What is the political economy around language? What are the attitudes? If we can't complete those things before design, it would be best to work those things into the beginning of the program before you have to get really detailed in terms of what, all the other details. And then ensure that what you do design into the program is responsive to the realities. You might it might take a long time to work up to your ideals. You may have to start with some other responsive activities that actually correspond to the reality that you're facing. And if the realities change, then allow the program to change as well. And that's one thing I have to give kudos certainly to the USAID colleagues here, because they have really worked closely with us to look at within our scope, how can we still follow what's in our scope, but also make sure it's what makes sense for the context and be sensitive to the changes in the context. So we haven't gotten as far in Nepal so far as we would like, but I think there's a lot of hope now for being able to provide support for more focus on that area. So thank you. I just wanted to mention the share at rti.org. A lot of the reports on the programs that I've talked about are available on this website. So I just wanted to mention that as a spot for more information. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Wendy, and to all the presenters. This is Allison again. Those were some really interesting presentations, and we certainly understand this has been a complicated, complex, but also I think rewarding process that all of you have gone through. So we'd like to take some questions now. If you do have questions, please use that Q&A folder there to relay your questions, and I've been looking at the questions that have been coming in to present to the presenters today. We have about 25 minutes or so that we'll be taking questions, and if you send us questions and we aren't able to get to all of them, we will try our best to provide written answers to the questions when we send out all of the presentation materials. I think I'd like to start with some of the questions that take us back a bit related to some of the foundational pieces that are needed when you're implementing these programs. Of course, Wendy mentioned needing to deal with the political situation, but another question that came up was how to deal with the language writing systems and orthographies. We received a couple questions about that were for both or all three countries, asking if there were any issues around languages that did not have orthographies when you started out and how you may have dealt with that particular challenge. And another question related to Ethiopia, Susan Durston asks, and possibly Nepal, that some languages have been written down in Latin script, where the main national language has a different script. What have been the implications of this? So we'll start with those two language-related orthography questions.
I'll just jump in quickly for the Philippines, that there were no issues with the two mother tongues that were presented for or that were assigned to the BASA program. And they were originally assigned or chosen by DepEd based on the fact that my understanding is that many of the languages within that region or in those districts actually had that common language. So it was easier to choose those two languages. While there were a lot of different mother tongues within that region, those were the most prevalent. So it made it an easier place to start. I don't know if Dr. Ocampo is still on the line and she can speak a little bit more to that possibly.
Because the Philippines has over 170 languages or mother tongues, what we tried to do was to evaluate or to do an assessment of how many were spoken by most children. And based on data from not only the government or the Commission on Languages, but also with the help of NGOs such as the Summer Institute for Linguistics, and then the data that was collected by the teachers themselves through the DepEd Central Office. This number was reduced to the first 12 languages in the first year of implementation. And then after a year or two, it became 19 languages. And with the 19 languages, more or less, about 85 to 90% of children could understand those languages. It wasn't always their mother tongue, but it was something that they could speak in and interact with and through. By the time 2017 had come, there was already a list of 87 languages that were being developed in different stages of development. For one, developing the orthography, or two, developing the primers, meaning the spelling system, developing and codifying these languages in a way that early grades teachers would be able to understand, interpret, and implement. I think that was a very important thing to do. So by now, expect more languages to be moving along in the process of codification, so that it gets towards the level of creating materials in those languages rather than using a mother document and translating those into the languages. Hopefully, we shift now to more indigenous processes of developing the language materials or the learning materials for teachers and then eventually for children. I hope this helps.
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention quickly in Ethiopia, we did, so there, was an issue with languages that before had been using the GIA's script and started using the Latin script. in the 90s. And there the issue was mainly with the folks that we were working with to write the materials, because they themselves had been educated using the other scripts. And so, and what the biggest problem we ran into was because Amharic, the script is syllabic, and you know, the Latin script, of course, is more phonemic. We had to work with them on finding a middle ground, because it was really hard for them to break those syllables down into individual sounds. And so we had to try to work with them on that, but also look at, you know, if there was some middle ground in terms of allowing some, you know, syllable level chunking. And then the one disadvantage, I think, is that we didn't really have an opportunity to work so much on Amharic as a second language. So we didn't have the opportunity to support as much the transition from the Latin script local language to Amharic. So, you know, that is probably one disadvantage. With the English materials, we could then, though, provide more support for the Amharic and Tigrinya speakers who were transitioning from those scripts to Latin script. I'm going to turn it over. In Nepal, the languages we've been talking about using are already written, but Jim has been working on you know, developing orthographies in some of the other languages. So I'll let him talk about that a little bit.
Since the languages of Nepal belong to different language family, we might have different writing skill, orthography. It is said that 14 languages have their own scripts, and rest languages don't have their script, and it is very difficult to develop their script. Right now, Language Commission is going to work on identifying the phonemes and phones of language using minimal PS with the help of Devanagari script of Nepali. We are developing phonemes of 19 languages in Nepal with the help of linguists and language community in Nepal. We hope that we will develop the phonemes of languages based on their language family. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those questions and the responses. I'm going to move on now to a couple of questions we've received all related to language selection. Across all of the programs, how did you select which languages would be used in terms of specific criteria? And at the school level in particular, were decisions on which language to use based on any kind of regional, district, or school level data?
Well, in the Philippines, it was the regional languages were chosen for us. And so it was the mother tongue language, Filipino, and English. So we were following the curriculum that was set for us. So it was not by school.
For Ethiopia, as I think I mentioned before, it was really looking at population and making sure there was representation of some of the languages in SN and PR. But within SN and PR, it was the languages with the highest population. We didn't enter into school level decisions. We were helping to, you know, those decisions were already being made by, you know, different levels of government and schools where relevant, and we were simply working with them to provide materials, supporting them to make materials that would be appropriate for those areas. But we didn't enter into trying to help them make decisions about which language to use in individual schools.
If I may add, for the Philippines, is that all right?
Yes, please go ahead, Dina.
Right. Just to add that the languages chosen were really regional languages, and so it would have been extremely difficult to do it on a per school basis, because the financing of education in the Philippines is really driven from the top, and therefore it was important for the Department of Education at that time to be able to predict how many, for example, books would be needed in a particular language, how many teachers would be needed to be trained in a particular language. So that was the way it had decided to do it from the time it began in 2012. Thank you.
We actually review the materials. That means the corpora or text of language, whether they are enough to use to develop curriculum, textbook, and other instructional materials. For example, there are several endangered languages in Nepal. That means we don't have enough materials or text or corpora to use in classroom. So that first of all, we are going to develop their corpora and text in order to develop their curriculum and textbook to use in classroom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to move on now to asking about materials development, since we've received a number of questions on that and people looking for information specifically about how the materials were developed. Were communities involved in developing them? Are they commercially produced? And what is the process perhaps for purchasing them and making them available to schools? And on that topic as well, people were interested to know how children's book publishers in the private sector might have been incentivized to develop children's reading books. And if I might add just another issue related to this, somebody's asking who has the copyright on the translated versions of these books. Did you change illustrations when you were translating in the Philippines in particular? Apologies, I didn't mention that. And just the process that you went through for getting books translated in different mother tongue languages.
Okay, for the BASA program, we had a different process for different types of books that we were using. For leveled readers, we had specialists that were working, alongside DepEd and project specialists and local language specialists that were working to develop the leveled readers in the mother tongues and Filipino and English. And then for some of the storybooks, as I mentioned in the presentation, we took local Filipino storybooks that were matched to the curriculum, and we had local language experts do some of the translating. But we also involved the teachers. The teachers are wonderful writers, and we had write shops where teachers came and we talked to them about and held seminars and workshops about how to write children's books, and they took their stories and ideas and did a beautiful job writing stories, and we helped them refine them. And then we worked with local illustrators and artists, and we had the books illustrated and published. So a lot of different variety for the books that we have. There are local language books available commercially. Ours are now, property of DepEd. They're part of the curriculum.
Yes, that's true. What we've tried to do using the BASA program was to pilot or to start first on these processes that Susan had described. And what we tried to do was to scale that up to all other languages. As we've been told that BASA Pilipinas we're just working on 2 languages, and there were another 17 that were being developed, and of course there are more that are different stages of maturity in terms of implementation of a full-scale mother tongue-based program. And it has been helpful to follow what the experiences and challenges and the learning that had been generated through the BASA program, and that we could now avoid pitfalls and some challenges because of these learnings when we started to develop for the other languages, or to refine also for the other languages. In terms of the question on procurement, Um, it's the Philippines has a very strict procurement law that we have to follow, and as a matter of fact, a lot of us are requesting that it be revised so that we can procure specific titles. Um, and so this has been a huge challenge, not only for the Department of Education. It was my biggest frustration when I was working there that we couldn't particularly make a list of books that we wanted to purchase, but rather we had to describe them and follow certain rules that really didn't make any sense when you're trying to purchase content of quality. Um, the the other thing about the other question had to do with copyright, and because the books that were commercially purchased, of course, the copyright remained with the bookmakers themselves. Those that were produced by the staff and the teachers of the Department of Education, which were done with the funding and the time of the Department of Education, became property of the department. However, the teachers' names were always in on the books, though they did not have any financial or economic gains from those materials that they developed. That's what I know as of now. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Textbook in some subjects have been translated by CDC, Curriculum Development Center, with the support of the concerned language community. That means the concerned community, language community had been used as an expert while translating textbook into different languages, 26 languages. And full copyrights belong to only CDC, not to the language committee.
And I'll just mention for Ethiopia, because it's a technical assistance program, we did not decide directly who is on the writing teams, but we worked with the regional state bureaus, sort of, talk to them about what types of expertise that you need to have. And so we looked for them to have, one or two linguists who know we're mother tongue speakers of that language, but also have understanding of linguistics, a teacher who understands about pedagogy and teaching young children, preferably experienced writers who've already written stories before, but if not, maybe additional teachers that could be trained up. And then after they would have a draft of the materials, there would be a language, like a community meeting with some sort of key figures from the community, people who had really a good understanding of the history and culture of the area and stuff like that, and they would review the materials and give feedback before finalizing them.
Thank you for responding to all those questions around materials development. I know there's a lot more to be said on that topic, and just as a little advertisement, if you will, or information, there is a recent half-day webinar that the Global Reading Network did on copyright and licensing issues. If you're interested in checking out those presentations or the recording of the event, it is on our website, and we're going to be producing some more resources and guidance on that topic soon. I want to now move to a number of questions that we've received on language issues in terms of transition from one language to the other, as well as dealing with some of the political and parental issues around language demand. We have a question regarding the Philippines, if there was any particular reason grade 4 was selected as a transition grade in the Philippines, and in any and all of the contexts, what factors are taken into consideration when deciding when the transition should be. I will tag on to that just in the interest of time, keeping with this topic. How is the government of Nepal, and I assume potentially also the Philippines, handling the issue of parental demand for English?
All right. With a question on choosing the 4th grade, I think that when the policies on language were being discussed, and there was a policy study on it, and parents groups were asked, when are we going to learn English? Because this is the what I would call the language of aspiration among many parents. And so we had to give them possible options. And many of them said it's okay as long as they're learning English from grade one, and they have to learn it. And so we negotiated by slowing down the process and moving the learning of literacy to third grade, but of the formal literacy to third grade, but developing oral language earlier from kindergarten with songs, and grade one and grade two for developing other language domains of literacy, until we used English as a medium for learning another subject matter later in the grades. That's really a huge factor as to why we did it. Um, the other one is that there is evidence from the experience of some schools that implemented the Filipino policy, the bilingual education policy, differently from the Department of Education. Because, for example, in the University of the Philippines, there's an autonomous laboratory school. And by the time the children were actually in grade two, they were literate, fluent in both English and Filipino. And so there's some basis to transfer sooner. Third, and I think this is the most important, socially, all over the Philippines, you see English everywhere. And I think that this varies depending on where in the Philippines you are. So I think that a combination of these three reasons is the basis for selecting fourth grade as when the new languages are used, or the languages of the curriculum, which are Filipino and English, at fourth grade onwards are used. It doesn't say that you cannot use the mother tongue to support the learning of children in other subject matter. But then this is the present state of policy. I'm sure that in 3-4 years we will have better data to support any opinion, because there was really not much data, Philippine data, supporting later transition also. So I think it was more prudent, and I think that parents were happier with that. So I hope that helps answer the question. Thank you.
In Nepal, actually, there is trilingual policy as a medium of instruction. In early grades, the mother tongue is emphasized to make learning effective and effective for the children. Then after, the Nepali language will be used as a strong language in Nepal. And then lastly, English will be used in the schools. But let's say there is a high demand of English in Nepalese community schools, but those demands cannot be regarded as genuine demand, since English are taught in Nepali and mother tongue in Nepalese schools. So that I mean to say that the preparation of teachers, providing enough materials teaching English, curriculum, and other managerial condition is not appropriate using English in Nepal. I mean to say that the teachers are teaching English in the mother tongue of children. That means it is not appropriate pedagogy for teaching English using mother tongue, I think.
And I'll add, I think this is something that the government here is struggling with, is addressing those demands, because there's definitely a recognition in the Ministry of Education that it's not appropriate. They don't have the capacity, even if they wanted to do immersion in English, even if they felt that was appropriate, they don't have the capacity. And so I think it's something that they're still working on how to address those demands of parents, because there's a lot of private schools here, and so there's attention, and I don't think it's completely been solved how to address it.
Okay, thanks everyone for shedding a little more light on that issue, which we know is one in many countries are facing. I'm going to conclude with maybe one more question, since several people have also touched on this, and then we'll conclude with today's webinar. We've received a couple questions related to teacher training and how teachers are trained, how frequently, and what's been your experience around training teachers to use these materials and implement this approach to reading instruction. And if you have also any insights on teachers have been able to read and write the languages themselves and potentially be able to teach effectively in classrooms where there may be multiple languages spoken.
In the massive transition from the bilingual education policy to the multilingual education policy, there had to be a very rapid teacher training program, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of teachers here. For example, in training for one grade level, let's say grade 1, we're looking at 120,000 teachers all over the country, and so we had to create chief trainers who would now train others. And in this ECHO training program, this is still down to district levels. So from region to division to district levels. I'm not a big fan of cascaded training programs, because at some point the cascade loses sound or voice. So what we did was to develop an alternate program, or a catch program. We call it the School Learning Action Cells. And in the School Learning Action Cells, what we did was to create material also on multilingual education. And teachers could do this in schools. Principals could organize small group sessions in their schools and talk about early literacy, the domains, how to teach them, look at the materials. They could lesson plan together. And so what we tried to do was to create a fertile environment in the school level, so that when the cascaded programs come down from the top, then there would be a synergy, hopefully, between these two types of training. And so that was the main thing that we tried to do. Very recently, I was informed yesterday that the School Learning Action Cell intervention for teacher professional development has, number one, been recognized as an official or accredited continuous professional development scheme, and the Professional Regulations Bureau will recognize them as valid teacher professional programs. And second, it has also been just selected as one of the good practices in government for efficiency and for effective delivery of services. So these are good things. These are good signs that outside the Department of Education, learning action cells are being recognized as powerful tools for developing professional learning circles and for better learning among children. Thank you.
Well, first of all, congratulations on the recognition of the learning cells. I think that's wonderful.
Thank you.
That kind of continuous low-level support is what makes a difference. In Ethiopia, unfortunately, the program didn't include ongoing support. So there's training for, in-service training for the teachers, but that was the only thing that was in the scope. And that was definitely a weakness. And I believe the upcoming project, I hope, is going to address that and make up for that weakness. And in Nepal, that's something that we've been looking at for the Nepal materials that have gone forward, the other mother tongues haven't been able to go as far forward, but the Nepali materials have gone forward. And there was initially trying to use an external coaching system, really relying on that, and that hasn't worked so well. So now we're working or supporting the government to try to shift to a combination school and cluster-based ongoing support. So there's the teacher professional development modules that they have that are regulated are a 10-day cycle. And then, so the teachers are all having that. And then, but we're working on really building up a better ongoing support system, because that's what's really going to help the teachers change their practice. In terms of the teachers who don't read very well themselves, I think that's a really excellent point. We haven't in Nepali, that's not so much an issue. We did in Ethiopia, especially in some of the southern, a couple of languages in the southwest, where the teachers didn't have mother tongue education when they were in school, and so they're not as comfortable. And so we did try to incorporate into the training opportunities to practice reading aloud. The teacher practicing becoming more, so when they do read alouds, they are modeling fluency. So that was something we tried to explicitly bring into the training.
Thank you. I don't know if Jum has anything to add at this point.
In my opinion, teacher training should be related to the content, pedagogy, and it must be linked with their career development of teachers. Nepal has introduced several modules of teacher training. There is a lack of on-the-spot support system. I need to say that actually teacher needs the technical support in the classroom. That is lacking in Nepal, in my view. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you again to all of our presenters. I know we've gone a little over time. Thanks for those who hung on to the end. I know there's a lot more questions that came in, some very specific, all equally important in terms of figuring out how we can all be designing language related components of these programs. So we're capturing these questions, and we'll hope to work with our presenters to provide responses to everybody as soon as we can. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we'll also be sending out the materials and making a recording available if you'd like to share with colleagues who weren't able to attend. The last note that we have here was asking about program documents and research related to these projects and efforts, and we will also coordinate with our presenters to compile any other additional information we can. So if you want to get more information, you have those resources available. So just let me thank all the REACH colleagues who helped put this together. Richard Felty and Lynn Alexander in particular at the REACH team, our webinar support team extraordinaire. And I'd also like to thank all the panelists for making the time, especially Dina, Wendy, and Jum, who are many, many hours ahead of us and I'm sure would like to call it a night. So we thank you very much. We hope to see many of you at the CIS annual conference in a few weeks. As you may have heard, we're presenting a workshop on early grade reading design and implementation, and we hope that you can join us. If you haven't registered, do so now, or you can also register when you arrive in Mexico. So thanks again, everyone, and we hope to see you at our next webinar.